Hey everyone, and welcome to my next video tutorial. So in this one I'm going to be painting this guy that I've been putting together, the Primaris Captain. And I had a poll up on the Patreon a little while ago, and just to help decide which chapter to paint this guy in, and the highest votes, it was actually a 50-50, but I have decided to paint the white scar because I thought it'd be good to do a tutorial on painting white. I think it's one of those colours that people can struggle with, not kind of know where to start. So for this guy, I've actually gone ahead and done a bit of a practice myself just to kind of get into the flow of doing it on this leg here. So I've gone for kind of a dirty sort of look. Pretty typical for me to go with that kind of look. Although a bit more refined than what I'd usually do. So I started out with priming the model with Corax White. Now I didn't actually use it from the rattle can. I think that the Corax White spray can is a bit notorious. I don't know if it's, maybe I just got a bad batch or something, but it's a bit notorious for going a bit kind of powdery. So I didn't want to really risk it on this model. So what I've used is the Vallejo Hobby Paint Spray. I used the white from that, and I bought a pot of the Corax White anyway. And I actually just airbrushed that and gave it a really nice finish. Corax White is an off-white. It's kind of very slightly grey, but has a slight warm kind of bone tint to it. So I thought it'd be really nice for doing a white scar. And I actually wanted to replicate what the heavy metal team has done recently with some of the white scar stuff. I don't know if you've seen the Corsaro Khan paint job they've done, but it's not a cool blue. They don't use like blues and things that people would normally, or what they would normally use for whites. They've used some browns and greys, which I wanted to have a go at doing. So this is what I've started on, and I'm going to go through the process of how I did it. Cool. So, like I said, starting with Corax White, and I should mention as well, I haven't used my airbrush at all for painting these bits. I did use it for the Corax White, but if you're game enough, you can use the spray can, the Corax White spray. You could do this process over, a plain white base coat, primer. If you find, a cheaper one out there, that's not Corax White. There's the Vallejo Hobby Paint spray. I'm sure you could find something else out there. So the first thing that I started to do with this was just to start soft shading it. So I've done a 2-part to 1-part mix of Corax White and Baneblade Brown. So that's going to start giving us that slight warm, dirty kind of tint to it. And so with light colors like this, I like to use a lot of feathering because you can get away with it quite easily. We're just doing a very subtle start to shading that there. I'm not going to go through it in this video, but if you have never heard of feathering, then I'd recommend you go and watch my fundamentals video that I put out last month or the month before. I can't remember now. But yeah, I just go through in that video some of my techniques that I use, glazing and feathering and stuff, and also some basics of paint mixing and stuff like that. So the feathering works really well for this and is actually quite fast. I was actually surprised myself how quickly I could get this first stage of shading and even the later stages of shading happening. So I'm applying this quite generously in terms of the space that I'm covering, because it's, like I said, it's very subtle. We're creating those soft sort of shading and just blending it out with the feathering. So on these flat surfaces, obviously, as I'm doing now, but also there's no harm in starting to establish the more refined and deeper recess shading in these kind of areas. Yes, I don't know if you can see it that well on camera, but it's, yeah, like I said, just creating a nice subtle start to the shading. And just giving us a bit of a foundation that will start to build some more shading over the top of. I do have to say Corax White is a really, really nice tone to work over. And the benefit of it, because it is an off-white, is that it's easier to do some of the later highlighting stages, because you can just use, straight white, paint white scar or something like that. Because it isn't pure white. You've got that option there. Obviously, if you'd started with a pure white primer or base coat, you can't go any lighter than that. So it's kind of the benefit of using an off-white sort of colour to start with. So obviously some areas are going to be even more in shadow, and these areas here will eventually have the cape, cloak, covering it up. So there's not a huge amount of point in going too crazy and making those areas look beautiful, but just something to be mindful of when you're working on the areas which are going to be even more in shadow. You can be even more generous with applying this colour. Some of these spots I'm not even feathering out. I'm just kind of applying it as a solid coat. Alright, well, that's it for that stage. As I said, it's pretty subtle, so I don't even know if you can really see it that much on camera, but oh well. We'll move on to the next stage. So, the next soft shading is an equal parts mix of Corax white and Baneblade brown. So this obviously is moving more towards adding a bit more kind of brown into the mix. And again, I'm just using a bit of feathering to blend that out a bit. You can always just use glazing if you're not comfortable with the feathering. Obviously you just thin it down to a glazing consistency, and then you just slowly build it up. That way, just pushing it towards the shadow areas. Which is tends to be a slower process than feathering, which is why I like the feathering, to be honest, because it's quite a quick way of laying out some nice little blends. And so obviously with this stage as well, I'm going over some of the areas that I've already applied that first stage of shading, because we're just building that up and making that shading a little bit stronger. And obviously we don't want to spread this too far across the flat surfaces, otherwise the model will start looking too much of a kind of bone color, and it might not kind of register as being a white model. We still want it to look like a white scar at the end of the day. Again, just going in and lining in the recesses as I started to do with the previous mix. Alright, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and finish off this stage as well. There's not a whole lot left to go. But it's kind of just the same thing over and over. Yeah, and then I'll come back and move on to the next stage. Alright, so the next stage is to really start to define the deep recesses. So for that, I'm going to go with a mix of 2 parts Baneblade Brown, 2 parts Skaven Blight, and 1 part Corax White. So the Skaven Blight and the Baneblade together just create kind of a dirty grey, and then the Corax just helps to kind of not make it so dark. So with that, I'm just going to start really concentrating on getting that right into the recesses, and I'm actually going to I'll start using a fine detail brush actually. That might be a good way to go. So getting really into those areas there. This helps to create a contrast, obviously. Help to kind of create that separation of the panels. And again, it's adding to that kind of dirty look because it's a brown kind of colour going into the recesses. It looks like the kind of accumulation of dirt and grime. Okay, so moving on to the next step. So from here, we're going to be using straight Skaven Blight Dinge. And again, we're just doing some fine recess shading. So this one, we're going to be quite kind of sparing with it and just try and hit the areas that are going to be the most in shadow. The ones that we really want to define. And just, getting as fine a point you can with your brush is really important. Because you don't really want to make mistakes. They can be fixed with a bit of the Corax White. But yeah, prefer to just get it right the first time. Obviously, it comes with practice. I'm not saying if you don't get it right the first time, then you're a bad painter or anything, but no, it's, definitely a practice thing. And like I said, this kind of discipline in, doing this kind of fine recess shading definitely helps to develop your brush skills, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. So it's all about honing the skills. Finding what works for you. You can already start to tell that that's really making things pop a lot more, which is nice. And I'm obviously using it to kind of flood these little details there. The consistency of this is a little bit thinner than the previous colour that I used, but it's just to help it flow a bit more. Being a darker colour, you want it to, that just helps you have a bit more control with it. The other thing I want to use the Skaven Black Dinge for is to start doing a bit of chipping, a bit of weathering. You don't want it to be too thin a consistency, so we're talking maybe like a layering kind of consistency. And we're going to be quite, you can go as heavy as you want or as light as you want with weathering. It's kind of up to you. I want to go quite subtle with it. Again, I'm kind of trying to, I'm using the Heavy Metals version of Khosrow Khan, the new model, as a bit of inspiration. So I'm going to be quite subtle with it. Just a few little chips and scratches here and there. Nothing too crazy. Skaven Black Dinge is a really nice grey actually, because it's got a slight brown tint to it, so it's good for the use, what we've just used it for, doing the recess shading and doing the chipping and stuff like that. Alright, so the final stage is just to do a bit of edge highlighting really. So I'm just using white scar, and so I'm going for more of an heavy metal style for this. I'm going to highlight every edge. Which I think works well for white because it just helps to give it more definition. All right. Well, that is pretty much it for painting the white armor. So finish off the edge highlighting. The other thing I used the white scar for is just doing some little scratches like that. So it's a nice extra little detail. So that's pretty much it. So that's a nice, easy enough way to paint a kind of a warm, dirty looking white. So I hope that helps someone out, and thanks for watching, and thank you for your continued support. Thanks.